Imagine a world where the first drop of human blood was never spilled by a brother's hand. Picture civilizations built on cooperation instead of conquest, technologies designed for life instead of death, and humanity reaching for the stars with hands unstained by violence. What if the very foundation of human nature was different because one man chose love over hate in a moment that changed everything? But what if Cain never killed Abel? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Our story begins in a time when the world was young, when only 4 humans walked the earth, and when the choices of 2 brothers would echo through all of human history. Chapter 1. The First Brothers. In the beginning, when the earth was still learning how to be home to humans, 2 boys were born who would shape the destiny of every person who would ever live. Cain came first, sliding into the world with strong lungs and grasping fingers, as if he already knew he would need to fight for everything he wanted. Abel followed, quieter, gentler, his eyes seeming to hold secrets even as a baby. Adam held his firstborn son and wept tears of joy mixed with fear. This child would never know the perfect peace of Eden, would never walk with God in the cool of the evening as Adam had. Eve traced her finger along Cain's tiny face and whispered promises that she would teach him everything she could remember about paradise. They named him Cain, meaning acquired, because they felt they had gained something precious from God despite their exile. When Abel was born, something different filled the air. Where Cain had announced himself with angry cries, Abel seemed to listen to sounds only he could hear. The animals gathered around him in ways they never did with Cain. Birds would land on his shoulders, and lambs would follow him before he could even walk properly. Eve watched this and wondered if God had given Abel a special gift to make up for the paradise he had lost. As the boys grew, their differences became clear. Cain loved the earth, loved making things grow, loved the satisfaction of seeds becoming food. He would spend hours working the soil, his hands deep in the dirt, coaxing life from ground that seemed determined to fight him. Every harvest felt like a victory against the curse that made the earth resist human efforts. Abel, meanwhile, was drawn to the animals that had multiplied across the earth since leaving the Ark of Safety their parents had told them about. He seemed to understand their languages, their needs, their fears. When a sheep was sick, Abel would know exactly what it needed. When predators threatened the flocks, Abel could sense danger before anyone else saw it coming. But even as children, there was something else growing between them. Cain carried the weight of being first, of being the one who was supposed to lead and protect. Abel carried the gift of natural grace, of things coming easily that Cain had to struggle for. Neither boy understood yet how these differences would test them in ways that would shake the very foundations of what it meant to be human. Chapter 2. The Offerings That Changed Everything. Years passed, and the boys became men with their own ways of serving God and family. The time came when they each felt called to bring an offering to the Creator, who had walked with their parents in paradise. This was not a rule given by Moses, not a law written on stone tablets. This was something deeper, a need in the human heart to give back to the one who had given them life. Cain gathered the finest fruits of his harvest. He had worked harder this season than ever before, pushing himself to grow the most beautiful crops anyone had ever seen. Grains that gleamed like gold in the sunlight, fruits so perfect they seemed to glow with inner light. He arranged them carefully, proudly, knowing that his offering showed the work of his hands and the skill he had developed over years of fighting with stubborn soil. Abel chose differently. He selected the finest lamb from his flock, a firstborn without spot or blemish. As he prepared his offering, tears ran down his face, not from sadness, but from understanding. This lamb had been born just months ago, full of life and promise. To give it up felt like giving away part of his own heart. But somehow, Abel knew that true offerings must cost the giver something precious. When the moment came to present their gifts, something extraordinary happened. Fire came down from heaven and consumed Abel's offering, the flames dancing with joy as if God himself was pleased. The smoke rose sweet and straight, carrying with it a sense of divine approval that everyone could feel in their bones. But Cain's offering remained untouched. The beautiful fruit sat there, perfect and unaccepted, while their giver's face grew dark with confusion and shame. Why would God reject such obvious excellence? What was wrong with the work of human hands, with the sweat and skill that had created such bounty? Then God spoke, his voice gentle but clear. "Cain, why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." In that moment, Cain faced the choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of every human who would ever be born. Jealousy burned in his chest like fire. Rage whispered that Abel had somehow cheated, had somehow stolen what should have been Cain's acceptance. The darkness suggested that there was only one way to make the pain stop, only one way to prove who was truly worthy. But what if, in that crucial moment, love proved stronger than hate? Chapter 3: The Moment of Mercy. The field stretched out before them, empty except for two brothers walking side by side in the late afternoon sun. This was the place Cain had chosen, far from their parents' eyes, far from any witnesses to what he had planned. The weight of the stone in his hand felt heavy with terrible purpose. Abel walked beside him, trusting and unsuspecting, talking quietly about the sheep that would need extra care through the coming winter. But as they reached the center of the field, something inside Cain broke apart. Not his resolve for violence, but something deeper, the wall he had built around his heart to keep out the truth he didn't want to face. The stone fell from his trembling fingers as he collapsed to his knees in the dusty earth. "Abel," he whispered, his voice cracking like a child's. "Abel, I am so angry. I am so jealous of you that it feels like dying. God accepted your offering and rejected mine, and I hate you for it. I hate you for being better than me, for everything coming so easily to you while I struggle for everything." Abel stopped walking and turned to see his brother kneeling in the dirt, tears making muddy tracks down his face. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the grass and Cain's broken breathing. Then Abel knelt beside his brother and put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Brother," Abel said softly, "God did not reject you. He rejected your offering because your heart was not in it. You brought your best fruits, yes, but you brought them to prove your worth, not to honor his goodness. You offered your success, but I offered my heart." Cain looked up, confusion and hope warring in his eyes. "But how do I change my heart? How do I become someone God can accept?" Abel smiled with a wisdom that seemed too old for his years. the same way I learned to care for the sheep. One day at a time, one choice at a time. Let me help you understand what God desires. Let me teach you what I have learned about offerings that come from love instead of pride. And there, in that field where murder should have been born, forgiveness took its first breath instead. Cain threw his arms around his brother and wept, not from anger now, but from relief so deep it felt like being born again. Abel held him and spoke words of comfort and promise, teaching him that true strength came not from being first or best, but from being willing to learn and grow. When they finally stood up and walked home together, their shadows fell side by side on the ground. The stone that should have been stained with blood lay forgotten in the grass, just another rock in a field that had witnessed mercy instead of murder. Chapter 4. Brothers United. The change in Cain was like watching a seed burst open in rich soil. Where once he had worked alone, driven by the need to prove himself, now he sought out his brother's wisdom and offered his own strength in return. The fields that had been separate became shared, and the flocks that had known only Abel's care now flourished under the attention of both brothers. Cain learned that the secret to acceptable offerings was not perfection of produce, but purity of purpose. When he brought the first fruits of his harvest now, he brought them with gratitude instead of pride, with worship instead of competition. God's acceptance came like sunrise after a long night, warming both brothers in the glow of divine approval. But their cooperation went far beyond religious rituals. Cain's knowledge of crops and seasons, combined with Abel's understanding of animals, created something new in the world. The first integrated farm, where plants and animals worked together to make the land more fertile and productive than either brother could have achieved alone. Abel's sheep provided fertilizer that made Cain's crops grow stronger and more abundant. Cain's grain fed Abel's flocks through harsh seasons when grass grew thin. Together, they discovered that the waste from one brother's work became the treasure for the other's efforts. It was a perfect picture of how different gifts could complement each other instead of competing. Adam and Eve watched their sons with wonder and growing hope. The curse that had made the ground resist human efforts seemed lighter when their boys worked together. The loneliness that had haunted the family since leaving Eden began to fade as they witnessed this new kind of love, not the innocent love of paradise, but the chosen love of forgiveness and cooperation. More children were born to Adam and Eve in those years, sons and daughters who grew up watching Cain and Abel work side by side. These younger children learned from birth that differences were meant to be celebrated, not feared. They saw how Cain's determination balanced Abel's gentleness, how Abel's intuition guided Cain's strength, how two very different people could become more together than either was alone. The first human civilization began to take shape around the principles the brothers had discovered. When disputes arose, they were settled through discussion and compromise rather than force. When challenges threatened the growing community, everyone contributed their unique gifts to find solutions. The foundation was being laid for a completely different kind of human society. Chapter 5. The ripple begins. As the years turned into decades, the children of Cain and Abel grew up in a world unlike anything that had existed before or would exist again. They had never seen violence between humans, had never witnessed hatred strong enough to destroy love, had never learned that brothers could become enemies. Their normal was cooperation, forgiveness, and the celebration of differences. When conflicts arose among the cousins, as they naturally would among any group of humans, the solutions came from the template their fathers had established. Instead of escalating disagreements into fights, they had learned to kneel together in the dust of honesty, to confess their jealousies and fears, to seek understanding rather than victory. The third generation grew even stronger in these principles. They created games that required cooperation to win, told stories that celebrated heroes who chose mercy over revenge, and developed traditions that honored the moment when Uncle Cain chose love over hate in that long-ago field. The anniversary of that day became humanity's first holiday, not a celebration of military victory or royal power, but a festival of forgiveness and brotherhood. But perhaps the most significant change was in humanity's relationship with God. Without the barrier of murder between them and their Creator, the growing human family maintained a closeness to the divine that was different from Eden's innocence. This was not the unconscious fellowship of paradise, but the chosen intimacy of people who had learned to overcome their worst impulses and seek their highest nature. God walked among them again, not in the cool of evening, as he had with Adam and Eve in Eden, but in the heat of midday, as they worked together in the fields. He spoke with them not just about spiritual matters, but about practical problems of farming and family, of justice and joy. The conversations were different now, more mature, more real, seasoned with the wisdom that comes only from choosing good when evil is possible. The animals, too, seemed different in this world. Without the scent of human violence in the air, they remained more trusting, more willing to work alongside the growing human community. The fear that would later divide humans and animals never took root, and the partnership between species grew stronger with each generation. As the community spread and grew, they carried these principles with them. New settlements were built on the foundation of cooperation. Trade routes developed based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. The very concept of taking by force what could be gained through friendship never occurred to minds that had been shaped by the example of Cain and Abel's transformation. Chapter 6. A World Without Murder. 6 generations passed, and something remarkable had happened, or rather, had not happened. In a world where hundreds of humans now lived, worked, loved, and disagreed, not one person had ever been intentionally killed by another. The very concept existed only in theoretical discussions about what might happen if someone chose the ultimate selfishness. Lamech, the descendant who in our timeline boasted of killing a young man and claiming sevenfold vengeance, instead became known as the Great Peacemaker. When his son accidentally injured a neighbor during work, Lamech's response became legendary throughout the growing human settlements. Instead of defending his child or demanding justice, he brought his entire family to serve the injured man until he was completely healed, then continued serving until the debt of pain had been transformed into a gift of love. The technologies that Lamech's line developed reflected this different approach to human problems. Instead of weapons, they created tools that made work easier and more productive. Instead of fortifications, they built bridges that connected communities. The metalworking skills that might have created swords were used to craft plows that could break ground more efficiently, musical instruments that brought joy to celebrations, and beautiful ornaments that honored the craftsmanship of human hands working in harmony with God's creation. Tubal-Cain, the forger of bronze and iron, became famous not as an armorer, but as an artist whose metalwork was so beautiful that people would travel for weeks just to see his latest creations. His workshops became centers of learning where young people from different communities came to master not just the technical skills of metalworking, but the deeper principles of creating beauty rather than destruction. The absence of violence had profound effects on human psychology and social development. Without the fear of attack, communities could spread their settlements for maximum productivity rather than defensive positioning. Without the need for warriors, the strongest and most capable individuals became farmers, builders, healers, and teachers. Human energy flowed into creation rather than destruction, into cooperation rather than competition. Justice systems developed around restoration rather than punishment. When someone caused harm through carelessness or selfishness, the community's response was always the same. How can we help this person understand the impact of their actions and choose better next time? How can we heal the damage and make the relationships even stronger than before? Children grew up with a completely different understanding of human nature. They learned that people were capable of terrible selfishness. The story of Cain's temptation was told in every family. But they also learned that people could always choose differently. They grew up expecting the best from others, while preparing to offer forgiveness when others fell short of that expectation. Chapter 7. The Flood Question. But even in this world of cooperation and peace, something was going wrong. As the human population grew and spread, a different kind of corruption began to take root. Without the immediate devastation of violence, subtler sins had room to grow and flourish in ways that might ultimately prove even more dangerous to the human spirit. Pride, unchecked by the humbling reality of human violence, began to inflate human hearts beyond all reasonable proportion. Communities began to see themselves as superior, not because they had conquered others, but because they had achieved greater prosperity, greater beauty, greater technological advancement. The competition that might have led to war instead led to a kind of spiritual arrogance that considered some humans more valuable than others. Materialism flourished in ways that violence might have prevented. Without the need to prepare for conflict or fear the loss of possessions to raiders, humans began to accumulate wealth and luxury for its own sake. The simple lifestyle that had characterized the early generations gave way to increasingly elaborate displays of abundance that served no purpose except to demonstrate status. Most dangerous of all, the very success of human cooperation began to breed a forgetfulness of God. As communities solved more and more problems through their own wisdom and strength, they began to feel less need for divine guidance. The regular times of prayer and offering that had sustained the early generations became formal rituals rather than genuine communion with the Creator. God watched these developments with the same heartbreak he had felt when violence first entered human hearts. The corruption was different, but it was real. It threatened to separate his children from him just as surely as murder had, and in some ways, it was more dangerous because it was harder to recognize and easier to justify. When Noah was born into this world, he stood out not because he was a warrior in a violent age, but because he maintained simple faith in a sophisticated time. While others built bigger houses and accumulated more possessions, Noah continued the practices of the early generations, walking with God in daily conversation and living with the humility that recognized human dependence on divine grace. The flood, when it came, was not God's response to violence, but to spiritual blindness. The waters that covered the earth washed away not blood-stained altars, but golden temples, not weapons of war, but monuments to human pride. Noah's Ark carried into the new world not just the last good family, but the memory of what humans could become when they chose cooperation over competition. humility over pride, and love over the subtle selfishness that corrupted even peaceful hearts. Chapter 8. The Tower of Unity. In the generations after the flood, humanity once again multiplied and spread across the earth. The descendants of Noah carried with them both the memory of the great deluge and the deeper memory of Cain and Abel's reconciliation. These twin memories shaped their approach to the great project that would define their age, the building of a city and tower that would demonstrate human unity and capability. But this Tower of Babel was different from the one built in our timeline. Instead of being motivated by pride and defiance against God, this tower was conceived as a monument to the brotherhood that Cain and Abel had established. The builders wanted to create something so magnificent that it would inspire future generations to maintain the unity and cooperation that had allowed humanity to survive the flood and flourish afterward. The construction itself became a model of the principles it was meant to celebrate. Instead of slave labor and competitive building crews, the work was organized as a vast cooperative effort where every person contributed according to their abilities and received according to their needs. Engineers worked alongside laborers, artists collaborated with architects, and every decision was made through consensus rather than authoritarian command. The tower rose higher than any structure humans had ever built, but its true achievement was not its height, but the way it brought together people from across the known world. Languages that had begun to diverge after the flood found common ground in the shared vocabulary of construction and cooperation. Cultural differences became sources of strength rather than division, as each group contributed their unique insights to the great work. Yet even this noble project carried within it the seeds of the spiritual danger that had led to the flood. The very success of human cooperation was once again leading to a forgetfulness of divine dependence. The builders began to believe that their unity made them equal to God, that their achievements proved they no longer needed divine guidance or limitation. When God came down to see the city and tower, his concern was not that humans might storm heaven through violence, but that they might lose their souls through pride. The confusion of languages that followed was not a punishment, but a rescue operation, designed to prevent humans from achieving a unity based on their own power rather than their shared need for God. The scattering that resulted from Babel's fall was different too. Instead of hostile tribes dispersing to conquer new territories, the scattered peoples carried with them the principles of cooperation they had learned during the Great Construction. They established new communities based on the model of peaceful collaboration, creating a network of civilizations connected by trade and friendship, rather than conquest and domination. Chapter 9. Abraham's different calling. In this world shaped by brotherhood rather than violence, Abraham's calling took on a different character. Instead of being called to leave a land corrupted by war and idol worship, he was called to leave a prosperous and peaceful civilization that had grown comfortable with its own righteousness. The challenge was not to escape physical danger, but to maintain spiritual alertness in the midst of material success. God's covenant with Abraham included promises that went beyond what was offered in our timeline. Not only would his descendants become a great nation, but they would serve as guardians of the peace that Cain and Abel had established. They would be teachers of reconciliation, models of how differences could become sources of strength rather than conflict, living reminders that humans were capable of choosing love over hate, even in the most difficult circumstances. Sarah and Abraham's approach to family conflicts reflected the principles they had learned from the ancient story of the two brothers. When tensions arose between Sarah and Hagar, Instead of banishment and abandonment, the solution was patient dialogue and careful arrangement of responsibilities that honored everyone's dignity and needs. Hagar remained part of the extended family, and Ishmael grew up alongside Isaac as a brother rather than a rival. The test of Abraham's faith took a different form in this timeline. Instead of being asked to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham was challenged to trust God's promise that Isaac would father many nations, even when the young man showed no interest in marriage or children, preferring the contemplative life of a scholar and teacher. Abraham had to choose between forcing his son into the role he expected and trusting God to work through Isaac's actual gifts and inclinations. Isaac's upbringing in this culture of peace shaped him into a different kind of patriarch. Where violence might have made him strong and decisive, the security of a peaceful world allowed him to develop his natural gifts of wisdom and patience. He became known as the great mediator, the one who could help feuding communities find solutions that satisfied everyone's deepest needs. The wells that Isaac dug became symbols of something more than just access to water. Each well represented a new source of life and prosperity that could be shared by all the peoples in the region. When conflicts arose over water rights, Isaac established the first international protocols for shared resource management, creating legal frameworks that ensured no one would suffer thirst while others had abundance. The marriage of Isaac and Rebekah was arranged not through negotiations between potentially hostile tribes, but through a careful process of finding partners whose gifts would complement each other in service to God's larger purposes. Their wedding became a celebration that brought together multiple communities in a festival of unity and mutual blessing that lasted for weeks. Chapter 10: Moses and the Laws of Love. When Moses received the law on Mount Sinai, the tablets contained commandments designed for a world that had never known murder but needed guidance to maintain its peace. "Thou shalt not kill" was included not as a prohibition against an existing practice, but as a warning against a temptation that could still arise in human hearts, even after generations of brotherhood. The additional laws that Moses received focused heavily on the positive obligations of community life. Where the original 10 Commandments prohibited harmful actions, the extended law code provided detailed instructions for building and maintaining the kind of society that Cain and Abel's reconciliation had made possible. There were laws about how to settle disputes before they escalated into serious conflicts. There were regulations about sharing resources during times of scarcity, ensuring that the abundance of good years would be stored and distributed to prevent anyone from suffering want during difficult seasons. There were detailed instructions about how communities should cooperate on large projects, how to maintain trade relationships built on mutual benefit, and how to welcome strangers and integrate them into existing social networks. The Israelites' role in this alternate world was not to be a nation that conquered the Promised Land through military might, but to be a people who demonstrated how God's principles could create a society of justice and peace. They were to be teachers and models, showing other nations how to organize themselves according to divine wisdom rather than human ambition. The journey through the wilderness took on different significance when it was not preparation for war, but education in dependence on God. The manna that fed them each day was a lesson in trust rather than a military supply system. The pillar of cloud and fire guided them not away from enemies, but toward the understanding that divine guidance was more reliable than human planning. When they finally entered the Promised Land, it was not through conquest, but through invitation. The peoples already living there had heard about the Israelites' unique approach to justice and cooperation, and many communities voluntarily joined the new society rather than being displaced by it. The land itself seemed to respond to this different approach. Where violence might have soaked the soil with blood, the ground received the offerings of a people committed to life and growth. The harvests were abundant, the flocks multiplied, and the land became known throughout the ancient world as a place where God's blessing was evident in both the natural prosperity and the social harmony of its inhabitants. The temple that was eventually built in Jerusalem became not just a center of worship for Israel, but a place of pilgrimage for people from all nations who wanted to learn the principles of peaceful cooperation that had made such prosperity possible. Instead of being a fortress protecting a chosen people from their enemies, it was a lighthouse showing all peoples how to live according to God's design for human community. Chapter 11: The Hidden Gospels of Peace. In the dusty libraries of ancient monasteries and the carefully guarded archives of Eastern Orthodox churches, scholars have found references to alternative gospels that tell a very different story about Jesus' mission on earth. These texts, known collectively as the Gospels of the Continuing Peace, describe Christ's teachings in a world that had already learned the fundamental lesson of choosing love over violence. According to these suppressed manuscripts, Jesus came not to redeem humanity from the consequences of Cain's murder, but to complete the work of reconciliation that Cain and Abel had begun. His message was not about forgiveness for sins committed, but about the ultimate transformation that was possible when humans fully embraced their capacity for divine love. The Sermon on the Mount, in these alternative accounts, includes additional beatitudes that specifically address the challenges of maintaining peace in a world that had never known war. Blessed are those who prevent the first conflict, for they shall preserve the heritage of brotherhood. Blessed are those who choose cooperation over competition, for they shall inherit the abundance of shared prosperity. The crucifixion itself takes on a completely different meaning in these texts. Instead of being necessary because of human sin and violence, it becomes a voluntary demonstration of love so perfect that it transforms even the theoretical possibility of violence into actual impossibility. The resurrection is not victory over death caused by sin, but the revelation of what life looks like when love becomes so complete that not even death can interrupt it. Early Christian communities described in these Gospels organized themselves very differently from the churches we know from our timeline. Instead of gathering primarily for worship and teaching, they functioned as cooperative societies that demonstrated the practical applications of Christ's teachings about sharing resources, resolving conflicts, and maintaining unity despite differences. The Apostle Paul's letters, in these alternative versions, focus not on justification by faith versus works, but on the ongoing process of community building that makes Christ's presence visible in the world. His churches were not havens for individual believers, but training centers for people learning to extend the principles of divine love into every area of human society. The persecution of Christians in this timeline came not from political or religious authorities threatened by a new movement, but from economic powers who saw the Christian emphasis on sharing and cooperation as a threat to systems based on accumulation and competition. The martyrs died not for their beliefs about Christ's divinity, but for their refusal to abandon communities based on radical economic equality. These hidden gospels suggest that the Christianity we know developed only after the peaceful timeline was somehow broken, only after humanity lost its way and needed a message of redemption rather than completion. They hint at a cosmic tragedy that forced God to work through a different plan, to offer salvation to a humanity that had fallen far from its original potential. Chapter 12. Islamic Perspectives on Habil and Qabil. The Quran tells the story of Habil, Abel, and Qabil, Cain, with details that appear nowhere else in religious literature, and Islamic scholars have spent centuries exploring the deeper meanings of this pivotal moment in human history. According to Islamic teaching, this story reveals fundamental truths about human nature and the choices that shape not just individual destiny, but the course of all creation. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah recounts how Qabil's sacrifice was rejected not because of the offering itself, but because of the condition of his heart. The Quran emphasizes that Allah accepts only from the muttaqin, those who are conscious of God and seek to please Him rather than themselves. Islamic scholars point out that this establishes a principle that runs throughout all human history. God looks not at external appearances, but at internal motivations. Islamic interpretations of what might have happened if Qabil had chosen differently focus on the concept of fitra, the natural human disposition toward goodness that Allah placed in every soul. Scholars suggest that Qabil's different choice would have preserved this fitra in humanity, allowing civilization to develop according to its original divine design, rather than being distorted by the trauma of the first murder. The great Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali wrote extensively about the spiritual significance of the choice between the two brothers. He suggested that Qabil and Habil represent two fundamental approaches to existence: the ego-driven desire to prove oneself superior, and the soul-centered recognition that all goodness comes from Allah. Al-Ghazali argued that Qabil's repentance and reconciliation with his brother would have established a template for how humans could overcome their lower nature and achieve the spiritual excellence that is their true purpose. Sufi masters have long taught that the story of the two brothers is not just historical, but mystical, representing the ongoing choice within every human heart between the nafs, lower self, that seeks to dominate, and the ruh, spirit, that seeks to serve. They describe spiritual practices designed to help seekers choose the path of Habil, offering their best with pure intention, rather than the path of Qabil, serving their own ego even in acts of apparent worship. Islamic law, as it developed in this peaceful timeline, placed enormous emphasis on conflict resolution and community harmony. The principle of sulh, reconciliation, became central to all legal and social structures, with elaborate procedures designed to help disputants find solutions that preserved everyone's dignity and strengthened community bonds, rather than simply determining winners and losers. The institution of zakat, obligatory charity, took on additional significance as a practical application of the lesson Qabil learned from his brother. Instead of being merely a religious obligation, it became a celebration of the abundance that results when people choose cooperation over competition, sharing over hoarding, community welfare over individual accumulation. Modern Islamic scholars point to this alternative timeline as evidence for their belief that Islam is not just a religion, but a complete system for organizing human society according to divine wisdom. They suggest that the peaceful principles established by Habil and Qabil's reconciliation are what the Quran means when it describes Islam as the natural religion of humanity, the way of life that brings out the best in human nature, rather than trying to suppress its worst impulses. Chapter 13. The Buddhist Connection. The Buddha's teachings about the nature of suffering and the path to enlightenment take on profound new dimensions when considered in light of humanity's alternative timeline. Buddhist masters have long taught that all suffering stems from attachment and the illusion of separateness, and they see in Cain's choice between violence and reconciliation the fundamental decision that shapes all subsequent human experience. According to Tibetan Buddhist texts, the moment when Cain chose to confess his jealousy rather than act on it represents the first instance of right mindfulness in human history. Instead of being overwhelmed by his emotions, Cain became aware of them, acknowledged them, and chose to respond from his higher nature rather than react from his lower impulses. This established a pattern that made enlightenment accessible to all subsequent generations. The Dalai Lama has spoken extensively about this hypothetical timeline in his teachings about compassion and interdependence. He suggests that Cain's reconciliation with Abel would have demonstrated from the very beginning of human history that individual happiness is inseparable from the welfare of others. This understanding, which Buddhism considers essential for enlightenment, would have been humanity's starting point, rather than a difficult lesson learned through centuries of suffering. Buddhist concepts of karma become particularly interesting when applied to this alternative history. The law of cause and effect that governs all existence would have operated very differently if the first major human choice had been toward love rather than violence. Instead of generating negative karma that would need to be worked off through multiple lifetimes, humanity would have begun with a foundation of positive karma that supported rather than hindered spiritual development. The practice of loving-kindness meditation, which Buddhists use to develop compassion for all beings, would have been unnecessary in a world where humans naturally treated each other with the consideration that Cain showed Abel after his transformation. Instead, Buddhist practices would have focused on maintaining and deepening this natural compassion, exploring its implications for understanding the nature of reality itself. Zen masters have created koans based on the moment of choice between the brothers. What is the sound of a stone falling in an empty field? Show me Cain's face before he chose mercy. What did Abel teach without words? These paradoxical questions are designed to help students bypass rational thinking and directly experience the awareness that makes compassionate choice possible. The Buddhist understanding of no self, the teaching that individual identity is an illusion, finds perfect expression in the reconciled relationship between Cain and Abel. When Cain stopped trying to prove his superiority over his brother, he discovered that their apparent separateness was less real than their fundamental unity. This realization would have been humanity's inheritance rather than its most difficult spiritual achievement. Modern Buddhist teachers suggest that meditation practices in this peaceful timeline would have focused not on calming the mind from its habitual conflicts, but on exploring the infinite creative potential that becomes available when the mind is naturally peaceful. Instead of seeking liberation from suffering, practitioners would have been investigating the depths of joy and the possibilities for conscious evolution that open up when humans live in harmony with their true nature. Chapter 14: The Kabbalah's Secret Teachings. In the hidden chambers where Jewish mystics study the deepest secrets of creation, ancient texts speak of Cain and Abel as representing two fundamental forces that were meant to work together to repair the world. According to Kabbalistic teaching, their conflict was not just a family tragedy, but a cosmic catastrophe that threw the entire universe out of balance. The Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism, describes Cain and Abel as embodying the Sephirot of Gevurah, judgment or strength, and Chesed, loving kindness. These divine attributes are meant to work in perfect harmony, with judgment providing structure and boundaries for kindness, while kindness provides warmth and generosity for judgment. Their separation created an imbalance that affected not just human society, but the spiritual fabric of reality itself. Kabbalistic masters teach that if Cain had chosen reconciliation over violence, the result would have been the first conscious example of tikkun olam, repairing the world. Instead of the long, difficult process of spiritual evolution that has characterized human history, the healing of the breach between the brothers would have demonstrated immediately how divine attributes could work together through human actions to restore paradise on earth. The Hebrew letters that spell the names Cain, Kin, and Abel, HBL, contain hidden meanings that Kabbalists have studied for centuries. When the numerical values of these letters are combined in the right proportions, they equal the numerical value of words like wholeness, peace, and divine presence. This suggests that the brothers' reconciliation was not just personally healing, but cosmically restorative. The Tree of Life, the central symbol of Kabbalistic cosmology, shows how divine energy flows from the highest spiritual realms down to the physical world. Kabbalists teach that Cain and Abel's choice created either a blockage or a clear channel in this flow. Their violence would have damaged the pathways through which divine blessing reaches the world, while their reconciliation would have opened new channels for spiritual energy to transform material reality. Advanced Kabbalistic practices in this alternative timeline would have focused not on ascending to higher spiritual realms to escape the limitations of physical existence, but on bringing divine consciousness fully into everyday life. The brothers' example would have shown how human relationships could become vehicles for divine revelation, how family conflicts could be transformed into opportunities for spiritual growth, how differences between people could become sources of creative collaboration rather than destructive competition. The mystical tradition of the hidden tzaddikim, the 36 righteous people whose presence in each generation sustains the world, would have operated differently in a world founded on Cain and Abel's reconciliation. Instead of hidden saints whose righteousness compensated for the general sinfulness of humanity, there would have been visible communities of people living according to the principles the brothers established, serving as teachers and examples for the continued elevation of human consciousness. The ultimate Kabbalistic vision of the Messianic age, when divine consciousness will be fully revealed in the world, would have been not a distant hope, but a present reality that continued to unfold through each generation's deeper understanding of how to live in harmony with divine will and with each other. Chapter 15. The controversial Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds discovered caves near the Dead Sea containing ancient manuscripts that would revolutionize our understanding of early Judaism and Christianity. But among the hundreds of texts found in those caves, a few fragments have remained controversial and largely suppressed because they describe what appears to be an alternative version of human history, one in which Cain chose mercy over murder. These fragmentary texts, known to scholars as the Reconciliation Scrolls, describe an ancient Jewish sect that believed the traditional story of Cain and Abel was a coded warning rather than historical fact. According to their interpretation, the story was told to help people understand the consequences of choosing violence, but the actual events unfolded differently because Cain heeded God's warning and chose love over hate. The scrolls describe this sect, which they call the preservers of the first peace, as maintaining communities based on radical non-violence and economic sharing. Their practices went far beyond what other Jewish groups considered necessary. because they believed they were continuing a tradition that reached back to the very beginning of human civilization. They saw themselves not as innovators, but as conservators of humanity's original nature. Archaeological evidence from the Qumran site where these scrolls were found supports some of their claims. The community that lived there showed no signs of military preparation or defensive structures, despite being located in a region frequently troubled by conflict. Their agricultural practices emphasized cooperation and sustainability rather than maximum production, and their burial sites suggest a society with remarkably low levels of violence and inequality. The reason these texts remain controversial is not just their alternative history, but their claims about the present. The Reconciliation Scrolls suggest that the peaceful timeline continues to exist parallel to our own, and that individuals can align themselves with it through specific spiritual practices. They describe meditation techniques, community rituals, and lifestyle choices that supposedly allow practitioners to experience the reality of the world where Cain chose differently. Modern scholars who have studied these fragments disagree sharply about their authenticity and significance. Conservative historians dismiss them as later fabrications created by medieval pacifist sects trying to give ancient authority to their modern beliefs. But radiocarbon dating and linguistic analysis suggest that at least some of the fragments are genuinely ancient, dating to the same period as the other Dead Sea Scrolls. The most controversial aspect of these texts is their description of what they call timeline convergence, moments when the alternative history becomes accessible to people living in our violent timeline. They describe specific locations, times, and practices that supposedly allow individuals to experience the peace and cooperation that would have characterized human civilization if Cain had chosen differently. Whether authentic ancient texts or elaborate modern forgeries, the Reconciliation Scrolls have inspired modern communities that attempt to live according to their principles. These groups, scattered across the globe, practice radical nonviolence, economic sharing, and spiritual disciplines that they believe align them with humanity's original potential for peace and cooperation. Chapter 16: Technology Without Warfare. In our world, an astonishing percentage of technological innovation has been driven by military needs. The internet began as a defense communication system. GPS was developed for missile guidance. Even seemingly peaceful technologies like microwave ovens and duct tape have their origins in military research. But what kind of technologies might have developed in a world where human ingenuity was never focused on better ways to kill other humans? Computer scientists and futurists who have studied this question suggest that technological development in Cain and Abel's peaceful world would have followed completely different paths. Instead of investing massive resources in weapon systems, human societies would have focused their best minds on technologies that enhanced life, improved cooperation, and expanded human potential for creativity and spiritual growth. Medical technology would likely be centuries ahead of our current capabilities. Without the need to develop battlefield surgery and trauma care, research would have concentrated on prevention, longevity, and optimization of human physical and mental performance. Diseases that still plague our world might have been eliminated generations ago through focused research that wasn't competing with military priorities for funding and talent. Space exploration would have developed very differently without the rocket technology that emerged from weapons programs. Instead of the competitive space race driven by military concerns, peaceful human societies might have approached space exploration as a cooperative venture focused on understanding humanity's place in the cosmos, rather than extending territorial control beyond Earth. Environmental technologies would have had a centuries-long head start in a world where societies planned for long-term sustainability rather than short-term military advantage. Without the environmental destruction caused by warfare and the industrial systems that support military production, alternative energy sources, pollution control, and ecosystem restoration might have developed to levels we can barely imagine. Communication technologies would have evolved to support cooperation and consensus building rather than command and control. Instead of hierarchical systems designed to transmit orders quickly and securely, communication networks might have been designed to facilitate democratic participation, community decision-making, and the sharing of knowledge and resources across vast distances. Artificial intelligence, if it had developed in such a world, would have been programmed from the beginning with cooperation and life enhancement as its primary values. Instead of AI systems that model human intelligence based on competition and conflict, we might have machine intelligence that truly understands and supports the human potential for compassion, creativity, and transcendence. Perhaps most significantly, the absence of military technology would have meant that human societies never developed the capability for mass destruction that now threatens our survival. Instead of living under the constant shadow of nuclear weapons, biological warfare, and other existential threats, humanity could have focused all its innovative energy on technologies that expand consciousness, extend life, and explore the infinite possibilities for growth and discovery that open up when survival is secure. Chapter 17: Modern Politics of Peace. Political scientists who study the foundations of government and law face a startling realization when they examine how deeply violence is embedded in our current systems. Every government ultimately depends on the threat of force to maintain order. Every law is backed by the possibility of police action. Every nation exists within borders that are ultimately defended by military power. But how might human societies have organized themselves if violence had never been an option? In a world founded on Cain and Abel's reconciliation, the very concept of the state as we know it might never have developed. Instead of territorial entities that control populations through the threat of violence, human communities might have organized themselves around voluntary associations based on shared values and mutual benefit. Governance would have been a service provided by communities rather than a power exercised over them. Law in such societies would have focused entirely on restoration rather than punishment. Since the possibility of intentionally harming others would never have been established as a precedent, legal systems would have developed around healing relationships, compensating for damages, and preventing future conflicts, rather than deterring harmful behavior through the threat of penalties. Economic systems would have evolved very differently without the foundation of property rights that ultimately depend on the ability to exclude others through force. Instead of ownership based on the power to defend possessions, resource allocation might have developed around stewardship principles that recognized all wealth as ultimately belonging to the community and temporarily entrusted to individuals who could use it most effectively for everyone's benefit. International relations would be unrecognizable in a world without military power. Instead of nations balancing against each other through alliances and deterrence, global organization might have developed around cooperative problem-solving, shared resource management, and mutual assistance during times of crisis. The United Nations might have been humanity's first international organization, rather than a recent attempt to manage conflicts between sovereign powers. Democracy itself might have taken very different forms in societies that had never known the need to concentrate power for defense against external threats. Instead of representative systems designed to make quick decisions during crises, democratic processes might have evolved to maximize participation and ensure that every voice was heard on matters affecting the community. Modern challenges like climate change, global inequality, and resource scarcity would be approached very differently by societies that had millennia of experience in cooperative problem-solving. Instead of each nation trying to protect its own interests while hoping others will make sacrifices for the common good, global challenges would be met with the same collaborative approach that had characterized human society since Cain and Abel learned to work together rather than compete. The very concept of leadership would be different in societies that had never needed commanders who could make life and death decisions quickly. Instead of leaders who possess authority over others, governance might be provided by facilitators who help communities discover their own wisdom and coordinate their efforts toward shared goals. Chapter 18: The Psychology of Peace. Modern psychology and neuroscience are revealing how profoundly violence affects human development from the very earliest stages of life. Children who grow up in violent environments develop different brain structures, different stress responses, and different approaches to relationships than those raised in peaceful settings. But what might human psychology look like if violence had never been part of our species' experience? Developmental psychologists suggest that children raised in Cain and Abel's peaceful world would develop fundamentally different neural pathways from birth. Without the need to be constantly alert for threats, the human brain could dedicate more resources to creativity, empathy, and higher-order thinking. The fight-or-flight response that dominates so much of human behavior would be replaced by what researchers call the tend and befriend response, the natural tendency to care for others and build cooperative relationships. Attachment theory, which describes how early relationships shape our ability to trust and connect with others throughout life, would be completely different in a world where children never had to fear abandonment, abuse, or neglect. Secure attachment would be the universal human experience rather than the fortunate exception, creating adults who approached all relationships with confidence in their own worth and trust in others' basic goodness. Mental health conditions that researchers now recognize as often stemming from trauma would be virtually unknown in a society that had never experienced violence. Depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and personality disorders often trace their roots to experiences of harm or the fear of harm. In a world where such experiences were literally impossible, human mental energy could be directed entirely toward growth, creativity, and the exploration of consciousness rather than healing from wounds. Educational systems in such a world would be designed around cooperation and mutual support rather than competition and individual achievement. Instead of schools that sort children into winners and losers, educational environments might focus on helping each person discover and develop their unique gifts, while learning to contribute those gifts to community projects that benefited everyone. The psychology of work and career would be unrecognizable in a society where people never had to compete for resources necessary for survival. Instead of choosing careers based on financial security or social status, individuals might be free to pursue work that matched their deepest interests and contributed most effectively to community welfare. Relationships and family structures might evolve in directions that seem almost fantastical from our current perspective. Without the psychological patterns created by violence and competition, humans might develop capacity for types of love and intimacy that we can barely imagine. extended families and communities might function as unified support systems where every child had access to the wisdom and care of multiple adults, and every adult felt responsible for the welfare of all children. Even human lifespan might be different in a world without the chronic stress that violence creates in both individuals and societies. Research shows that peaceful, supportive communities produce significantly longer, healthier lives than those marked by conflict and inequality. In a world founded entirely on cooperation and mutual care, human longevity might extend far beyond what we currently consider possible. Chapter 19: The Soul's Reflection. As we reach the end of our journey through this alternative timeline, we must pause to ask ourselves the most important questions of all. What does this story teach us about who we are and who we might become? If Cain could choose love over hate in that crucial moment, what choices do we face in our own lives that might be just as significant? What does it mean that we carry within ourselves the capacity for both destruction and creation, both selfishness and sacrifice? The story of what might have happened if Cain never killed Abel is not just ancient history or philosophical speculation. It is a mirror that reflects our own potential, our own daily choices between cooperation and competition, between forgiveness and resentment, between building up and tearing down. Every time we face a moment of jealousy, every time we feel the temptation to harm someone who seems to have what we want, we stand where Cain stood in that field with his brother. But the story also teaches us that transformation is always possible. Cain's jealousy was real. His anger was justified from his perspective. His desire to strike out was genuinely human. What changed everything was not the absence of those feelings, but his choice to confess them rather than act on them, to seek understanding rather than demand satisfaction, to accept help rather than prove his independence. In our own lives, we face countless opportunities to choose the path that Cain took in this alternative timeline. When we feel overlooked or undervalued, we can choose to attack those who seem more successful, or we can choose to learn from them. When we face conflicts with family members, friends, or colleagues, we can choose to prove who is right, or we can choose to discover solutions that honor everyone's needs. When we encounter people who are different from us, we can choose to see them as threats to overcome, or as resources for learning and growth. The peaceful world that grew from Cain and Abel's reconciliation did not happen automatically. Each generation had to choose cooperation over competition. Each individual had to choose forgiveness over revenge. Each community had to choose inclusion over exclusion. The peace was not a passive absence of conflict, but an active commitment to finding better ways of resolving the disagreements and tensions that naturally arise whenever humans live together.